Hey everybody, my name is Scott Schmitz, and I am here with the Prime Minister of the Dominion of Melchizedek, Prime Minister David Williams, and we are starting a new series called Disproven with David and Scott. And the reason why we are doing all of this is because there's a lot of false information out in the social media sphere these days pertaining to governmental organizations, health, wealth, finance, basically you name it, you're getting lied to. We are here to help disprove some of the people out there who are purposefully leading you astray. I call them gurus because they're fake gurus. The reason why are they doing this is because they are making a lot of money off of you. And because of that, a lot of people get into these rabbit holes and they think they're going to do this or that. And it causes them major setbacks, both financially and politically and socially down the road. So today we are going to talk about a very, very, very important topic. And there's no one more qualified in this entire world than Prime Minister David Williams to talk about the fundamental human right of self-determination. Prime Minister Williams, thank you for being on the call today. How are you, sir?
Hey, Scott, I've been looking forward to this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the right of self-determination is the most fundamental right that we have, and we'll explain that as we go along. And I was happy to have you come out and say, okay, we need to start disproving these intellectuals that talk about things, but then they don't actually do anything. And the problem with it is they have no practical experience. So that puts them in a position where they can't speak fully about what they claim they're giving people education on. So that's why it needs to be disproven, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, particularly in this arena of international law and fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms, and how people are going to exercise that and do it peacefully. You know, in other words, like you got right there on the screen, get out of the system at getoutofthesystem.com. And the fact that you got lied to, just like I did, just like you did, we weren't taught history correctly. That's a rabbit hole. It's probably the deepest rabbit hole. And the reason that it is because they used the false history. Like Napoleon Bonaparte said, history is just a set of lies agreed upon. And so they use false history propaganda, as I call it, to keep people trapped into a, excuse me, to keep people trapped into a system where they really don't know what that system is, because they've been lied to about it their entire lives, just like you and I both were lied to about it. And we'll explain that as we go along. And I know that's why we're here.
That's fantastic. Well, our first debunking is going to be with a British chap named James Ker-Lindsay. And Mr. Ker-Lindsay is an intellectual. I can't remember which university he is over in the UK.
Nope, he's actually in Belgium.
Oh, he's in Belgium. Okay, yes.
He probably graduated in the UK, but he's in Belgium teaching.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. Very well-spoken individual. I'm not demeaning him in any sense of the imagination as far as his personal character or whatever, but the information that he talks about in a YouTube video that we're going to play for you snippets of here in a second are simply just not true. And Prime Minister Williams will pull up documents that you can go get off the internet disproving Mr. Ker-Lindsay. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here, and we are going to play a little bit of Mr. Ker-Lindsay's video here. So the video is on YouTube. It says, "What is self-determination? The most misunderstood idea in international relations." That much is true. And the reason why it's the most misunderstood is because nobody understands it. So I'm going to play you the first 2 minutes just so we can get an idea of what's going on.
Self-determination is one of the most misunderstood, if not misused, terms in international politics. In this video, I'm going to look at the meaning of self-determination, explain why it doesn't mean that every group that wants independence should have it. Hello, my name is James Ker-Lindsay. Welcome to Independent Thinking, a channel dedicated to international relations, independence, and the origins of countries. Self-determination has emerged as one of the most powerful concepts in modern international politics. Around the world, people vying for independence will cite a right of self-determination as the basis for their claim to be allowed to have their own independent states. Indeed, there are many people who believe that merely mentioning the words self-determination is enough to end any discussion on whether a territory should be allowed to break free. However, self-determination is also one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern international affairs. In truth, while it's correct to claim that peoples have a right to self-determination, this doesn't actually mean that they have a right to an independent state. Except in certain specific circumstances, self-determination actually means remaining within existing borders.
So I'm going to stop it right there, because what I want everybody to understand is what he just said about everybody not having the right of self-determination to form their own independent state is not true. Prime Minister Williams will shed light to that in a second. Let's continue watching here for another minute.
To understand why, it's important to take a brief look at the history of self-determination. Although the concept of self-determination emerged in the 19th century, it really came to the fore of modern international relations following the end of the First World War. The idea that people should have a right to decide their own future and live within their own territorial units was championed by the US President Woodrow Wilson. In his famous 14 points, he emphasized the need for different nationalities to be able to live within their own borders or else be permitted autonomous development. Speaking to Congress in February 1918, he stated, "Peoples are not to be handed about from one sovereignty to another by an international conference or an understanding between rivals and antagonists. National aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase, it's an imperative principle of actions which statesmen will henceforth ignore at their own peril."
Do you agree or disagree with that last statement that President Wilson said?
Well, absolutely. And here's the problem, Scott, what we're dealing with here. Everything he's reading is disproving what he said to begin with. When it's not making a distinction about territories and territorial integrity. If you want, real quick, I'll just go into screen share. I'll try to recall some of the things he said. And what we already see, that he's not teaching in international law, which are treaties and agreements and concordats and resolutions and other things that have already been agreed to by all the nations on the planet that are actually members of the UN, and other nations that are not members of the UN but are mere observers or are still up and coming, growing, getting their proof of concept and things in place to prove that they can actually join the family of nations, join the family of societies, and be a productive member in that. And then those aspirations would include possibly becoming a UN member or being an observer or being accepted by treaties and agreements with other countries as they start recognizing more and more recognizing people's right to self-determination.
Sure.
So,
well, let's play another 20 seconds.
I don't want to go
plenty of ammunition in the
can
next 20 seconds.
I want to go one place first, if I can go into screen.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Because this is an instant disproof. I mean, we're talking about human rights and fundamental freedoms. Okay. And the human rights treaties have become more and more prevalent in today's world, meaning there's things like the rights and duties of man, where it says that all men are born equal in dignity and rights and therefore should conduct themselves as brothers one to another. All right. Now, most of the planet right now is not doing that. And that's not new. It's been going on throughout time that people aren't treating each other very well on the planet. That's the reason we have such a history of war. But self-determination itself is found in a peaceful settlement, and I'll get into that in just a second. So let me pull up the document that I have in mind. So here we are. This is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is a human rights treaty. You see where it was signed and went into force on the 23rd of March, 1976. There are a lot of articles in here that the nations had to comply with. But complying with it means they voluntarily comply because they voluntarily agreed that these were the principles they were going to adhere to based on the UN Charter, which specifically pertains to peace and human rights. Now, whether it appears that way through implementation is irrelevant. The contract is in place and the treaty is in place, and this is what nations are to do. Now, if there has to be some adjustment later on because they weren't doing it, that's a different issue. But it doesn't negate what's being said and what's actually being agreed to and signed into law, because all law comes from these agreements. It all comes from these contracts. And Article 1 specifically says all peoples have the right of self-determination. It does not say anything about only certain people have it, which is what he was contending up to this 2.5-minute part in this video, is that only certain people have it. And it says right in here, by the virtue of this right, they may freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Pursue it. Okay. That's the part that takes time. And you also have to be able to conceptualize and understand what all of this means. So if you got another 20 seconds, let's go for that. And let me go out of screen share, or you take it back over.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, let me grab that and let's listen to Mr. Lindsay for a little bit more.
However, while the principle of self-determination was admirable, it proved hard to put it into practice. There were several major problems. For a start, there was the problem of applicability. What group should be allowed to form their own states? Was there a minimum number of people required? What about groups within groups? How far down should it go? And who should decide where to draw the line?
Okay, so that's the first thing, applicability. Those three things he just said, who can do it? Well, you just proven that everybody can. And who gets to determine whether or not they do it?
Well, let's do something. Let me go back in the screen share. Let's do something up front so that we can take a look at what self-determination actually means, how it is defined.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of international jurists that will tell you that it's actually not defined. And that's not true, because we can go into the agreements and the treaties that have been signed. And we'll go to this one, which is UN Resolution 2625. They might call it a resolution, but it's still a global agreement. All right, signed by 193 nations. And this is a declaration on the principles of international law, friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. And I wanted to kind of do this as a study. This is kind of like a work thing for us, okay? Because like if you wanted to go to court and say, okay, I'm going to like disprove something, or I'm going to prove something, right? It's a parliamentary, peaceful way of settling things, even though it's a dispute, right? And so what I'm going to do here with this is we'll do a Control F, and I'm going to type in the word establishment. Out of all the treaties and declarations, this is the only place where you're going to find the actual definition. There are lots of hints. There's a lot of places that mention it, but they don't specifically talk about it in this way. And there's a lot of international jurists and a lot of international teachers like this gentleman that don't understand this concept, or they don't go read it. The establishment of a sovereign and independent state, the free association or integration with an independent state, or the emergence into any other political status freely determined by a people constitute the modes of independent right of self-determination by that people. Now, in today's world, we consider that to be people of like mind. In the past, it was more based on ethnicity or culture or whatever other considerations that people had, where they gathered together for their own determination, for their own self-protection, for their own synergistically being able to work together to build something where they could supply for everyone's needs better than the single individual could supply for their own. So what we see here is that every nation state on this planet exists because of this right here. Scott, look, the establishment of a sovereign independent state is there. Therefore, every nation state that currently exists exercised self-determination to get here. In times past, as he said, the concept of self-determination, it really just changed the wording from what was called customary international law and the law of nations years ago to actually adopt the single word self-determination to talk about your political status, not meaning just that you self-determine and control your destiny, but you're also controlling your own self-governance, which in my mind means you can't control your own destiny unless you're controlling your own self-governance. Now, there's other things it says here, the free association integration with an independent state. Well, you've already integrated with a state, so you've already exercised self-determination now. And if you decide you want to change your nationality from, let's just pick an example of a Belgian citizen that wants to become a citizen of Brazil, just pick any country, it doesn't matter. All of those countries have naturalization processes. All those processes are self-determination processes. And this emergence into another political status determined by a people. Okay. Now, there's also another option here, and that's integrating with a nation state, taking a look at, let's say, the founders of the USA, that they formed up a brand new state. They called it United States of America. They did not call it Britain. They did not call it United States of Britain. And so literally they formed up within the British colonies because most of the people were still loyal to the king. Matter of fact, about 90%, because the king was not taxing them. The nobility who got the land grants were the ones taxing them. So this argument of no taxation without representation was not done by the average man. It was done more or less by the lawyers and the judges and merchants who did not like the Stamp Act. Although that Stamp Act was already applicable in London, and they were no different than any other British subject that had loyalty to the king, and they admitted that they had that loyalty. So they were trying to buck against something where they said there was no taxation without representation, when in fact they had representation because they had parliament. Now, that's a long-winded way of saying, look, all of these people, whatever reasons they did it, they established a new sovereign independent state. Whether it was a state that existed within another state, it does not matter. Today, we can see examples of that all around the planet. Rome is a city inside a nation state called Italy. The country of the Holy See, the Vatican, is its own nation state that exists inside Rome and inside Italy as a sovereign independent state. Now, having said all that as a backdrop, I guess one more thing I could pull up here. If people have any doubts at all about what I'm talking about, as far as self-determination, the UN has already agreed, all the nations, 193 in the General Assembly. Self-determination is integral to basic human rights, fundamental freedoms, says the third committee. This is the third committee on human rights discussions. And we also see that as a peaceful settlement, meaning if you don't like the system that you're in, if we look at your screen, it says get out of it, right? The Manila Declaration on Peaceful Settlement of International Disputes. And we can see in here that 4 times equal rights and self-determination of peoples enshrined in the charter. Okay. This is not a new concept. And I will go to what you said also about Wilson in just a few minutes. The inalienable right, meaning it's not applying to specific people. It's applying to everyone. The inalienable right of self-determination. This is the one right that cannot be leaned. You cannot give it away. I mean, you might end up being subjected to some other system, but you always will have this right, no matter what. In order to facilitate the exercise of people's concern or the right of self-determination, as referred to in the Declaration of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations, which we just pulled up. That's that one right here, the International Law Concerning Friendly Relations in UN Resolution 2625. And this one more time mentioned in here, that declares that nothing in the present declaration could in any way prejudice the right of self-determination, the freedom and independence as derived from the Charter of Peoples forcibly deprived of the right and referred to in okay. All of this is going in a loop now. This is the peaceful settlement. The resolutions are there, and all they're doing is reaffirming that these are the ways that people can get out of a system by forming up a new system, as it has been done in the past. Now, I will turn the screen back over to you.
That's great. Now, I think that you had mentioned something about the Holy See and the Vatican as far as territorial integrity. He next talks about that because it's kind of like for somebody who kind of understands the possibility of self-determination. Like I always ask myself, how do states form? They weren't just here, because when we fly over a continent in an airplane, there aren't lines on the map. So they're all human-made. And you touched on that briefly, and he's going to talk about territorial integrity. And I'm glad that he talked about it because we're going to be able to expound upon what he says. And like I said in the beginning, some of these things that he's saying are true. His overall point of the video is saying that you know, Tommy or Jenny or Manuel, you don't have a right to start your own nation. Because, and we'll get into it later, you were not occupied foreignly or under colonialism. So, all right, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to continue on this next one.
Secondly, there was the problem of implementation. The idea of giving peoples their own states could work in cases where specific communities lived as homogeneous groups within defined boundaries. However, the real world is not that simple. In many cases, a territory could contain many different groups. How would statehood be decided in these cases? For these reasons, the Wilsonian concept of self-determination, while very powerful as an idea, was never as practical as it may have seemed.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there because in theory, that is correct. How can you have different peoples living within a square kilometer, square mile of each other, have so many different ideas, and they're all going to start their own nation? But realistically, in practice, it's never going to happen. Would you like to expound upon what he just said, or should I keep playing it?
Well, the reality of that is it has happened in the past. If you look at the number of people that may have been on the planet or whatever, let's take, say, a native tribe in North America. If they had a disagreement and they decided that, okay, part of our society no longer agrees with the other part of our society, we're going to pick up our homes, our teepees, or whatever it is, take our bows and arrows and our baskets and for gathering fruits and berries and all of that, and we're now just going to split it. You guys move to the other side of the lake, you hunt deer, antelope, raccoons, whatever you're going to hunt, and you gather berries and you plant your fields and your corn and your maize and you do whatever, and you guys stay on that side of the lake and we will stay on this side of the lake. Okay, that would be a peaceful way of doing it. I'm not saying it was always done peacefully, obviously, probably not.
Sure. Now from
but there is just an example of self-determination, and this has been going on for thousands of years. This is nothing new.
Correct. Now, from his perspective, I can see his point of view coming from the standpoint of an individual living in one of these huge cities around the globe, especially in Europe, where you're on the 20th floor and you have thousands of people. How can one building have 1,000 different nations? I mean, technically it can. Will it? No.
No. He's right. He is right about the difficulties. This is not easy. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. I know, because I've been doing it. You know, just today, I got a phone call where next week on Zoom, I will be on with the Secretary of State and a governor in the nation of Honduras, where we just sent a container of humanitarian aid. They thanked us, the people of the Dominion of Melchizedek, because there's not just me. You can't just be one person. That's not self-determination. It says the self-determination of peoples. So you got to have people of like mind come together. Now the question is, and he mentioned it, how many? Who decides how many? Well, those people decide how many. 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. Was there some rule that said, oh, you got to have 56? No. How many did it actually start with? Two people signed it. That was it. And then they gathered more. There's an illusion that everybody met in one room and it was all signed. And John Adams said that never happened. We were at war. You know, war was going on. There was all kinds of things that were happening. And so people signed as they were able to come in and out of Philadelphia, and those that agreed to. There was a lot that did not agree. There was a lot that would not buck the King of Great Britain. Why? Because the British Empire was the biggest empire on the planet at the time. And that's another issue of this, is you're talking about stepping out of a system that you've been in all your life. It's like the allegory of the cave. Once you're in the cave, you think everything in the cave is real, even though you think there's all that shadow play, and you think the shadows are real. And it's only till you get out and start looking, beyond, to see something more. So on the one hand, I applaud the fact that these people do teach self-determination. But if you're going to teach that it applies to all people in accordance with the human rights treaties, the international covenant, then make it about all people. Don't tell people they can't do it when it's obvious that by contract and agreement globally, anyone can. It's just not going to be easy. It takes work to find people of like mind to come together. And when I say people of like mind, Scott, I'm really looking at what we're talking about, the difficulty of the changes. Most of throughout history, it was done by ethnicity, culture, and that. So that you could be in an ethnicity and still not be of like mind. But when you take a look at what happened with the, say, I'll go back to the United States of America, because in international law it has been written that they became the model for all the rest of the breakaway colonies. In other words, a model was established. Were they all the same ethnicity? Were they all the same family? Absolutely not. What proves that they were of like mind? The declaration that they wrote. Okay. That is the new model. That is how now, and new models are now going to be created. You know, we're already doing that. Because back then, you know, this recourse to war seemed to be the only way to ever settle anything. That's no longer be allowed. It's just not going to be allowed. If people have any doubt about that, I suggest they start looking up in the sky and seeing what kind of technology they got by satellite, because, you know, over the next, I'd say 10 years, you're going to see more and more controls put down on people. And the dividing line is going to be those that submit to the system that they're in, no matter what happens to it or how much more draconian it may become, or people that decide they're going to want their freedom, and self-determination will be the way they get that freedom.
Sure, very good points. And, you know, I applaud Mr. Ker-Lindsay for, you know, talking about this topic. The one issue that I often have trouble with is he's an intellectual, and like you said in the beginning, he's never put this into practice. He doesn't understand how difficult it is or even how to do it. That's why speaking with somebody like you, who's qualified because you were the prime minister of a recognized nation in the family of nations from other countries around the world, you are qualified to speak about it, just like the president of Russia or Brazil. Whether they know it or not, they should. That's a whole different topic for a whole different day. But this is part of the reason why we're doing this debunk series, is to let people understand you have to vet people who are you're listening to. Have they done what you're trying to do? So let's go a little bit further with Mr. Ker-Lindsay. And I'm glad that his video was only 8 minutes long, because we could be here for hours, even though I'll probably say that half of what he says we agree with. It's just the other half, these half truths, are what stop people.
And well, not only that, it will end up destroying you. You have to be 100. You cannot be wrong in doing this. You have to be right in doing it. If you become unpeaceful or you do anything that's against any of the agreements that have already been made, it doesn't matter whether or not you knew them. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. And the law comes from these agreements. It comes from these treaties. International law, if anybody doesn't understand it, is supreme law of the land. Even the U.S. Constitution, I keep going back to that one. Obviously, I was born here. I've read many, many other constitutions. And the Russian Constitution talks about self-determination, okay? But theirs talks about the law of nations. And the law of nations goes back, as far as I can trace it back, it was mentioned in Levy's History of Rome about events that occurred in 500 BC, where 3 ambassadors got killed, and they went to war over that violation of the law of nations. So this is not new, it is old. And before we go a little bit further, Scott, I want to bring up one thing that he did mention, because he talked about President Truman. And let me go into screen share myself.
I think it was President Wilson.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right, President Wilson. Truman talked about it himself as well, but you're right. Go back to World War I. World War II was Truman. So now we're in my screen share, and you can see, look at the top here, who did extensive writings on self-determination. Vladimir Lenin. And if we reach a little further, let's just go treat this as a study event. Self-determination Wikipedia. We go quickly into Wikipedia. We'll just use this little Control F function one more time, so we can go find exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so we're looking for Vladimir Lenin. We see what Woodrow Wilson had to say about things. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. Imperative, the principle of action is action. It's not thinking about it. It's actually doing something. And this, he had already used this quote in his points. Now we'll go down further. We'll see what Mr. Lenin had to say about it in 1914 when he wrote the document I just had up. It would be wrong to interpret the right of self-determination as meaning anything but the right to existence as a separate state, meaning exercising self-determination to become that separate state. Okay.
Anything less are two very powerful words.
All
It's
right.
kind of like all. Well, what does all mean? Well, all means all. That's all means.
Yeah, all people have the right. All people have the right.
Anything less. I don't know, unless you're doing math, what anything less than anything is.
Well, real quick, I want to go, let me go pull up something real quick. I'll go back in the screen share one more time quickly.
You can keep yours on because I can go back and forth.
Okay. This would be the Law of Nations, Book 1, nations considered of themselves. Okay, so what does this define? Book 1 is about nation and what a nation state is. Book 2, and by the way, this is natural law. When you look at Law of Nations, the subtitle of this book is called The Law of Nations as Applied to the Conduct of Societies and Sovereigns, okay? Or nations and sovereigns, whatever you want to call it. Blackstone's commentaries, used extensively in the 1700s, used the word community and societies way more than it used the word nation. And it would also use the word, he also uses the word state quite a bit. But I'll quickly go down. These principles are so simple and so easy, and they've been around forever. And to say that these have somehow changed, that somehow customary international law has changed and it doesn't apply to any or everyone anymore, as Blackstone said, this is the great universal law, and it is adopted fully in British common law, meaning it is the supreme law. And you can't get more universal than the word universal, right? And so it talks in here about the celebrated question of whether a man can quit his country or the society which he's a member. Every man born free and equal and the son of a citizen, when he comes to the years of discretion, meaning you finally come to the years of discretion. I'll tell you right now, Scott, that occurred for me at age 40. I don't think I had a lot of discretion until I started learning this and testing this system and finding out what I was in, that I had no clue what I was in. I had been lied to. It was very obvious I had been lied to the moment I actually decided to read Constitution and other things where it granted the government the power to keep secrets from me. Like, why would I want to be in that? Why would I want to have a government, be under a government that's going to keep secrets from me? How does that affect my own self-determination? How does it affect my destiny? How does it affect my life? So when we look at this, he may examine it, whether it's convenient for him to stay in that society for which he was destined by birth. If he does not find it advantageous to remain in it, he is at liberty to quit it. Quit it and do what? There's only one answer: self-determination. You have to either get out and join something else, go be a citizen somewhere else, or join a nation state that's already existing where they have left the charter open signatory, or you got to find a bunch of people to come together and do it on your own. But that is the essence of what he's talking about with his video. So I'll let you continue from there.
All right.
Even to this day, these two questions of applicability and implementation often pose profound problems when we think about secession and independence movements. The next phase in the story comes with the end of the Second World War in 1945. The principle of self-determination was enshrined in the Charter of the newly founded United Nations. Chapter 1, Article 1, Paragraph 2 states that the purpose of the United Nations is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. However, balanced against this, Chapter 1, Article 2, Paragraph 4 also stated that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations.
All right. So the reason why I want to stop it there is I love how everything is always about war.
Yeah.
And yes, what he says is in the United Nations, but you don't have to go to war to self-determine.
Well, that's the whole reason it was put under peaceful settlement. I mean, it is the peaceful settlement. If you don't like it, quit complaining and get out. Now, here's what's interesting about this. First of all, he's reading a document where the second thing he read, or the first thing he read here was an Article 1, Section 2. Okay, so he read Section 2. It says right in there equal rights, but now he's going to come back and tell you that you don't have equal rights. So this is, you know, it's an oxymoron. Like you got him playing
Yeah, I got him muted so you can talk because he's.
I want to go back to let's read that in territorial integrity thing again under Article 4 one more time.
Okay.
All right, so then he switches to this thing about territorial integrity, and he starts applying this to borders. Well, didn't I just mention that the Vatican sits inside the borders of Italy?
Correct.
Have they invaded Italy? Have they somehow interfered with the territorial integrity of Italy? Have they tried to overthrow the Italian government? And the answer is no. So they're proof positive right there that a society can exist within these boundaries that you're talking about, because boundaries don't exist in the real world. Those boundaries exist on a piece of paper. And we all follow those agreements for those boundaries. But unless you're trying to overthrow them, and I'll give you an example for this, Scott. How many embassies would you say are in Washington, D.C.?
I think there's something like 187 of them out of, I believe, 193 nations.
187.
Something like that. It's like 98%.
Right. They're all here. High-level dignitaries, high-level ambassadors, high-level emissaries, consular agents, all these functions that they do for their people while they're on this soil. Are their people trying to oust out the U.S. government?
No, they're not.
Have they been graciously accepted here to come in and do state's business?
Yeah, they're allowed to come and go as they please, as long as they're not causing problems.
And therefore, they have not interfered with territorial integrity. The territorial integrity has still left the U.S. and its police forces, state patrol, National Guard, and all that in complete control of the territory that the U.S. claims that those forces apply to. And the other people, when they come here, whether it's an embassy of Bolivia or anyone else, they agree that, yep, you guys are the police force. As a matter of fact, if we have a problem with anyone, including your citizens coming onto our property, we're going to call you to come get them off, because we have an agreement under consular relations and embassy and diplomatic relations that the property that we're sitting on while we're here has complete and total immunity. And we have our own integrity here in this place, and we're not subject to having your people come on our property while we're here. Same thing with any U.S. embassy in any other country. The rules apply universally.
I know I often talk with people, and this specific topic right here is tough for people to understand from the standpoint of, well, how do we go about property ownership? Because let's say I go and buy 1,000 acres, and then if it's deemed an embassy, that gets taken out of the tax rolls. This is the convoluted thinking of people, and they're like, well, the United States government isn't just going to let China come in and buy 10,000 acres and take it off the tax rolls. Well, I got news for people. It's already happened. They're called free trade zones around the country, and I think there's like 40 of them.
Yes, China has I have not checked recently. If you're telling me there's 40, I wouldn't doubt that a bit. I know the last time I looked at the number of free trade zones that China has in the United States of America on their quote territory, it's actually no longer U.S. territory. It's a free trade zone by agreement, and China has full jurisdiction, and the U.S. cannot put their police forces there.
Correct. And people have this convoluted idea of territory in having the ownership. And it's like a lot of these embassies up in Washington, they do not buy the property that they're in. They simply lease it. But
Right.
even by mere lease, it is, and yes, maybe the property owner pays taxes on it, but while they are occupying it under the jurisdiction of their mother nation, the United States has zero ability to come in there unless they name them persona non grata. And then they have to give them notice. That's a whole different story. But these types of things are what confuse people, because they're just like, oh, well, if that's the case, I'll just self-determine. Like he said in the beginning, I'll just self-determine just by merely saying it. No, that is not true. You actually, like you said, you have to put the work behind it. But if you gave enough money for a certain parcel of land in Texas to the United States government, and you said, look, we're going to use this as an embassy, and they're like, fine, whatever, we don't care anymore.
Right.
I don't think they're going to care, because they're going to surround you on all sides. Julian Assange is a great example of
I
this.
was gonna bring that up. Thank you.
For how many years did the quote unquote most powerful nation up until the United States, the empire builder, just leave him alone in the Ecuadorian embassy?
Yeah, they followed the international agreements. They followed the law.
Correct. So I know, and that's part of the convoluted nature, because it's difficult for people who haven't gone to peace or a warring mindset to think, so you're telling me that I can buy some property, it's all my own, and then if they come on it, I can shoot them. See, that's the mentality of the majority of people. And that's the reason why implementation, that we will agree with Mr. Ker-Lindsay, it's almost impossible for the majority of people, because it's the people who have the problems, not the principle of self-determination. So
Yeah, there's a word that goes along with that. And in international law, that is the word inviolability, meaning they can't come on the property. They have the agreement. And there's something that people are so unaccustomed to. You know, Scott, you and I were born US citizens, right?
yes, sir.
So my point about that is I never knew this until I started studying the international law. Did not know it, did not see it. My wife and I had moved to St. Kitts because we wanted to live outside the US. And I thought that would also put me outside United States jurisdiction. It does not. They have total jurisdiction over all their citizens worldwide, no matter where they go, because the jurisdiction extends to this society, not merely to the land and or territorial integrity. That's why they have things like extradition. Hey, send our citizen back. He did something wrong. So in studying all this, I was really interested in having that inviolability and looking at like what we're talking about here, get out of the system. I was like not happy with what I was seeing going on in terms of me paying for war that I wasn't interested in. So people have to make their own decisions about what is moral to them, what's not moral to them, and what they're willing to do. Now, I was actually going to bring up something here out of book 4. I'm going to go into screen share again myself, because this is the book on peace. It's about the restoration of peace, book 4 in the Law of Nations, how to restore peace and of embassies. So if you go down to section 55 of the right of embassy, or the right of sending and receiving ministers, everything we just talked about is under this. And by doing this, it says it's necessary that nations enable and treat and communicate together. It's necessary. We all live on the planet together. It's necessary. And they should hold intercourse together in order to promote their own interests and to avoid injuring each other, and to adjust and terminate their disputes. This is what this is all about, living in peace right here. Everything we've been talking about. So to contend that people don't have the right of self-determination for some reason when they're actually going to peace, not violating anyone else's territorial integrity, and then developing a way in which they, if they want to, can claim their own territories later on, or develop their own embassies and diplomatic missions later on. I'll give you an example, going back to the Vatican and also to the Knights of Malta. Those two, until the Vatican actually claimed that they had 109 square acres of land that was going to be their quote sovereign territory, they still claim that they were sovereign for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they were acknowledged as being that. And the same is true of the Knights of Malta, who's actually part of the UN as an observer, recognized by 117 nation states. And they even have their own link that says INT, which you can't get unless you are acknowledged as a sovereign state.
And they don't have any land.
Well, they claim that they are landless.
Yes,
But they also claim that all of their missions are peaceful, and they have a completely limited, different agenda than the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's continue here. But first, before that, I would like to take a moment and acknowledge our sponsors. Our sponsors are getoutofthesystem.com. You can't get out of the system until you've gotten the system out of you. So at getoutofthesystem.com, you can go there and check out this webpage. Prime Minister David Williams does teach courses at getoutofthesystem.com. This is where you can find more information like what we're talking about here, to not only where you're going to get black ink on white paper type of information, but you're going to get accurate information from a multitude of different professionals and teachers. So if you want to find out more about how you can continue your learning outside of this video, go to getoutofthesystem.com and register for that today. So let's get back into the rest of this video with Mr. Ker-Lindsay.
This created an apparent contradiction. How could people have the right of self-determination and yet countries have a right to have their borders respected? To square the circle, the idea of self-determination was further refined in the decade and a half that followed. In 1960, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 1514, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. Article 1 stated, the subjection of people to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights, is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. Following on from this, Article 2 noted that all people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. However, balanced against this, Article 6 of the resolution stated that any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. In effect, two distinct forms of self-determination now emerged. One of these leads to independence, the other to self-rule within a state. The form that leads to independence is usually known as external self-determination. However, this is understood to apply only to cases of alien subjugation. Specifically, this is understood to mean cases of colonialism or territories under foreign military occupation.
Okay, so that statement right there is the reason why, Mr. Ker-Lindsay, you have been debunked. You have been disproven. Either you're willingly being paid to lie to people, or you are just ignorant of what we've talked about, because that is why we're doing this video. That is not true. If you want to expound upon that, you can.
You know, like I said, I many times on this website and the DVDs, I've done all this teaching over the experience I've had for 21 years now, and then beginning a process of exercising self-determination, noticing the federal courts, noticing the U.S., and having received back nothing but honor from the U.S. in doing so, because I was willing. And there is something in the law of treaties which actually overrides every single thing. It's called the Pacta Sunt Servanda rule, that everyone agrees that all agreements, all treaties, all global contracts must be and shall be kept. And they have agreed that everyone has this right. Everyone, not just people that are under military occupation. And it says alien domination. Well, that's a very, very vague term. What does alien domination mean? Does it mean being in a debt-based system that you no longer want to be a part of? Can you create a new system? Can you get out of that one? Can you have immunity and variation by agreement so the liability for using it doesn't even stick to you? That's what inviolability means. So I know these are, like, I'm speaking fast about it, and this is the reason people need to go to the website. Look, I explain these kind of things in detail, but the point here is, like you said, is that he's telling people, he's coming up with reasons why they can't do it. And he's actually saying that this was granted to someone. And if you want to, let's say, pause this for a second or whatever, I want to pull up something. I just thought about playing it because, like I said, for me, it's always about teaching. It's always about learning. And it doesn't mean, let me go into screen share real quick. I'll just
go ahead.
Just do this. It doesn't mean that always everything just comes out of some writing. I mean, the writings form the basis of law, but we're always talking about principle. We want to know what the principles are, and you can learn principles from a child, right? So we look at things like this. This is the International Covenant. Here's the Law of Nations. Here's the rights of people to self-determination, struggle by all means available. All means available. Importance of the universal realization of the right of peoples to self-determination, the speedy granting of independence to colonial countries. Well, if it has to be granted to you, that's not actually the model, Scott. What did the founders of the USA do? Did they get anything granted to them?
No, they took what they wanted.
They assumed their separate and equal station. They didn't wait around for the king to grant them anything. And they even say so in their case law, that the signing of the treaty was not a grant of their sovereignty. It was an acknowledgement of it. Then we take a look at something like this. Law of War Desk Book. Where is this out of? JAG manual. How many pages? 269. The newest one, this was in 2011, Scott. The newest one is 2015 is actually over 1,200 pages.
Peace.
So these things are expansive. Now, what do we want to look at in here? Well, the first thing it actually shows that under international law, you have two forms, private and public. Then you have under the public, law of war and law of peace. And you notice under law of war, they got this entire hierarchical structure to manage war. Look what they had under managing peace. Why? Because if you go to peace, how are you going to be managed? You're not there to be managed. You're there to be at peace, to treat your brothers as one to another. This is the only method of doing this. So let's take a look at something else that they say down here.
You would think that every hippie from the 70s would be all over this.
I know.
Love and peace.
It's not
Yeah.
easy because, Scott, I'll tell you this. I mean, you've heard me say it. If you're born in Buckingham Palace, if you had been taught this as a child, right? As we become older, we have so many concepts that are anchored into our brain. They're like a barb, like a fish hook. And ripping those concepts out where we were falsely taught, falsely programmed, given false history, those things hurt on their way out. It's an emotional scar because we're emotionally tied to our own belief system. So deprogramming and pulling that stuff out, depending on people's attachment to it, depends on how far they're going to go and how hard it's going to be for them to get out of the system, to deprogram and reprogram. So we'll look at something like this. There's several different concepts he's talking about in here. Define territory, which can be established even if one of the boundaries is in dispute. Really? It can be in dispute and claimed by another state. Does it mean they're at war? No, they're just disputing over a boundary line on a map.
Yeah, I think over in Israel, it's well known between Palestine and Israel. They're in dispute, and both nations are in the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a nation state that has tried to claim a territory that they say is dead man's land in between Serbia and Croatia. Now,
what nation is that, or what supposed organization is that?
Well, they're calling themselves Liberland, and they have so few problems because they're not getting it right. And I know they're not getting it right because Croatia is keeping them off the land. And they say that Croatia is not claiming it, but they're still policing it. So the claim is incorrect. I did a lot of study on that. And also they have some problems when it comes to understanding the implementation of self-determination. They don't get it because there's certain things they don't get conceptually. I won't go into detail about that. That's a different topic for a different time. But it also says in here that it must have a permanent population and it must be significant, permanent, even if a substantial portion is nomadic. So it means you can be nomadic. It means you can move from one embassy to another embassy. There are people here in the United States that I have met that they might have been from Bolivia or somewhere else, but they came here as a dignitary and their families have maintained that. They never went back home. They stayed here to do state's businesses they were paid to do on behalf of the Bolivian government. Or some other governments. And maybe they did fly back and forth, but that doesn't mean your residency is not the same as what in international law is called your settlement. The settlement was still back in Bolivia, even though they were on foreign territory doing business and doing state's business for the nation state. So I won't go any further into this. The other thing that becomes ambiguous here is what does the word significant mean? Because he mentioned how many people, who's making that determination. Can a small handful of people be more significant than a population of people that just don't mind being subjected? Well, that was covered in the Law of Nations as well, Scott. We'll go back to book 1 and we'll find this is what the founders of the USA were actually reading from when they did the things that they did. So we're on the restoration of peace. We'll go back to book 1 real quick and we'll go back up to, I said, what do you do after? It says you can quit it. So what do you do after? And then 33 in this real quick. And I find it just a problem that these professors don't know this. All right. So it says, if the question be to quit a form of government to which it alone appeared that people were willing to submit when they entered the bonds of society, if the greater part of a free people, after the example of the Jews in the time of Samuel, if they're weary of liberty and resolved to submit to the authority of a monarch, those citizens who are more jealous of that privilege, that means freedom. So invaluable to those who have tasted, although they're obliged to suffer that majority to do whatever they please, they are no under obligation to submit to the government. They may quit a society which seems to have dissolved itself in order to unite again under another form. They have the right to retire elsewhere, sell their lands, and take with them all their effects. But we already know there's no more land that's claimed on the planet, and we know that other nations, other sovereigns, like the Knights of Malta, are claiming land with sovereignty. So it's the society that is sovereign, not the land. Does that kind of answer what we're talking about here with this professor?
Yes, yes, it does. And I think we can pretty much wrap it up there. I mean, he goes into a few other things where he talks about, I guess, I don't know if you want to discuss internal versus external self-determination, because he does talk about that here next. But that's internal self-determination. It's convoluted because it's not self-determination. That is just using the nation, the government that you are already part of, using the privileges that they extend to you to privatize your life even more.
Right. It comes down to that granting thing. And I didn't play what I was looking for. What I said I was going to play. So let me go back. I'm going to take a second. I'm going to go find it. One of the things I look at, Scott, and the reason I'm pulling this up is I look for how you can find principles anywhere, especially in television shows or movies or radio or anything. And I believe that some of these messages are put out on purpose to teach us, to train us, to tell you need to go actually research something. The right of self-determination has actually been mentioned in at least 5 or 6 different television shows or movies that I could mention, one of them being The Hunger Games, The Last Mockingjay. I watch these things because I want to see if they're putting this information out to the public, for those that can see it. And that's the reason for doing the website, for doing calls like this, is to get people to wake up and start looking and seeing what's right there in front of them that they didn't know was there in front of them. I didn't know it for 40 years, actually 43 years, because I didn't read the terminology self-determination until 3 years after I decided I need to, not be ignorant of the law anymore, and not be ignorant of constitutions, not be ignorant of how things work on this planet. So this was a little video clip from something I saw recently. I'm just going to play it. It's less than a minute, I think, or something like that. But it's very apropos in what we're talking about right now. So here we go. This was from a recent Marvel release.
You called for me, my king?
We're old friends. Enough of the my king business. I have a task for you. I need you to figure out which of these Inhumans we can send her.
Like a forced conscription?
Call it whatever you want. The royal family can't be allowed to return. If Black Bolt returns, they lose their newfound freedom.
I don't think this is the freedom the lower caste is looking for.
That's the problem with those people. They think that freedom is something granted, but it's not freedom until they earn it.
Still, it's not what they're expecting.
Look, it's in our best interest to have any confrontation down there, rather than have them come back up here and ruin all we've done.
I understand, Maximus.
You know what? I like my king better.
Okay. All right. So does that little video speak volumes about what goes on in the world today?
Yeah, yes, it does.
Yeah, he took over and ousted his brother from being king, told all the people they were going to be free. And then he tells people, look, I'm on a conscript army out of the lower caste of people. He said, I don't think that's the kind of freedom they're looking for. Right. He said, well, it's not what they're expecting. So that's the problem with those people. They think it's granted, not earned. Got to be earned. And it's unfortunate that our higher education systems and places, I've said it years and years ago in one of the presentations I did 10 years ago, that even at Harvard or whatever, where people go to learn law, there's elements of law that they don't teach or train any of these attorneys on. And this is one of those areas. I just had a conversation with an international lawyer last week. I asked him if he had read the charter and understood what self-determination was. And he said, no, I don't know anything about it, but it sounds serious. He said, but I got 4 minutes. I got to be in a meeting. So let's talk about it later. And that's a common conversation for me, where I have nothing against the legal profession. Maybe some of the people in it, but people need to know the law. The law, ignorance of the law is no excuse. We've said it for a long time. If you don't know what your rights are and know how to defend them, then you don't have rights. the right of self-determination is the highest right on this planet.
It is. And, you know, there's no other, like you just said, there is no other higher right. So with that, I'm going to show Dr. Ker-Lindsay. We're pretty much done with him, although his attempt to inform people is there. His content on showing a path is not. And because of that, you have been disproven, Ms. Ker-Lindsay. And if you ever want to come on and debate either myself or Prime Minister Williams on this topic, we will gladly take on that. So with that, I'm going to let Prime Minister Williams wrap it up, but we are happy that you joined us here for this educational video. It's been about an hour, and we're going to be putting out more content like this because we are living in a time in society where people no longer have the ability to just sit idle and think that everything will be fine, because the powers that be, the organizations that actually run the world, are now making people uncomfortable to make them choose what they want to do. So with that, Prime Minister Williams, do you want to have any closing thoughts?
Well, I don't think I could have said it any better than what you just said. People are going to, you know, that's why originally, if I go into screen share myself real quick again, let's see. Back into 2010, when I decided that, you know, people like myself, what we call the public, the common man or whatever, and don't get me wrong, I don't think the common people can do this. I've always said this is either done by uncommon men or common men that do uncommon things. You can't just go along to get along anymore. Like you said, they're going to make people make a choice. And so I'm in screen share, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's take a look at this. You have to get out of the system page there now, but when I started teaching originally, I had this right of self-determination page, and this I'm on the Wayback Machine now, and you can see the archive or whatever, and this was archived a long time ago. But I branded it. I branded this Matrix Solutions because I saw that we were part of a matrix, and that, you know, if we wanted to wake up from it, you know, they gave us a choice. And they even said in the movie later on, the problem is choice. So what we do, and what I did then, and what what Get Out of the System is all about, is going down the rabbit hole and finding all of these things where, as I asked someone a long time ago in learning this way back in the year 2000, I said, is it possible that everything I was taught was a lie? The money rabbit hole, the legal, I didn't know anything about money and how it was created, didn't know anything about law, didn't know that I was lied to in the school system, not because the teacher was intending to it, because they were not trained properly. The history, the lies that were there, being a patriot and saying, well, I have to be patriotic, when it's like the Nuremberg trials proved point blank that you can't be patriotic. You will get crucified when you obey immoral principles, right?
Yes.
And we had the corporate rabbit holes, the language rabbit hole, that's all been distorted, entertainment rabbit hole, cultural rabbit hole, and the government is God, and also aspects of religion. And because I've said for a very long time that all religions are governmental in nature, because the word government means governmentus, meaning to control your mind, and all the governments basically have religious symbols all over their flags, and people treat it as if that, and I know that that's true, not to degrade anyone, because I did all that myself. I thought that the things that I had grown up and believed could not possibly be wrong, and therefore whatever it was that I was living in and supporting had to be the greatest thing on this planet. I proved myself wrong. And that was the beginning of getting out of the system.
That's a great place to end. Well, I thank you very much, Prime Minister Williams, for your time today. And I look forward to doing some of these in the future. And we hope that all of you enjoyed this presentation and that you will join us on our next edition of Disproven with David and Scott. Have a good day.